PhD, all right? Okay, I'll never have one of that, you know. Anyway, he's not from here. Did you know that? He's from Rhode Island. Anyway, he comes to us with a bachelor's in philosophy, a master's in systematic theology from Mount St. Mary's Seminary and University. Then he pursued a PhD in Florida, specializing in the evolution of Christian mystics in the medieval Europe. A lover of St. John of the Cross, has served on various levels throughout Florida, mainly in catecheses, director in various roles there, and more recently is a professor of spiritual theology at our own Notre Dame Seminary here in New Orleans. When we were putting together, all of this kind of 24 hours who we might get to speak and so on, I thought of Dr. Neal. Deacon David was with us at the time, and I said, well, he's one of your professors. You're probably closer to him than me. Call him up and see if he can come. I don't know, but he said he couldn't come. There was some excuse, I don't know what it was at the time. So anyway, I said, I'm going to put an Irish text on it. I didn't tell you that part. So anyway, then all of a sudden we get a text from him saying he's coming. I said, you can send him a text back now and tell him Father Billy has now removed the Irish text. So, Dr. Tom Neal, welcome to St. Anne.
Thank you, Father Billy, very much for that interesting introduction. I've never been introduced before by explaining that I was brought here by a hex while you were waiting for me to come out of the restroom. So those are two firsts. I'm very honored to be here. Deacon David, Frank, wherever you are, is such a good man. He's a very persuasive man. The combination of Irish and Irish on me, it was I couldn't, the guilt, it's all built into me. My mom installed all the buttons and they pushed them all. No, but I'm honored to be here. My family, my wife and 4 children, and I love St. Anne's. We come here for a lot of your marvelous events, enrichment, prayer, adult faith formation events. This is our place for confession. You didn't hear that, Father Billy? We love this place. This is a beautiful home and full of grace. So I was honored to be asked to speak about, to speak on this feast of Our Lady, and to speak about Our Lady. And I'd like to also add into the talk tonight a reflection on baptism, and put them together. Because what we believe about Mary, everything we believe about Mary, every grace that she received, we also, through baptism, receive. Mary is not the great exception. Mary is the great exemplar. She is everything we hope to become, everything God has destined us to be. Back in 1987, a very dear friend of my family growing up, her name was Muriel Bassett. She was like a second mother to me and my siblings. She was a beautiful, beautiful human being, she and her husband. A very self-giving human being. Probably in my life, next to my own mom, and my own wife, the most self-giving person I know. I could tell you a lot of stories about Muriel. Let me just say one thing. She worked for Catholic schools as a school teacher for over 25 years. And because her husband made a sufficient amount of money to support her husband and their daughter, she gave all of her tuition back to the school, all of her salary rather, back to the school. She wouldn't take her salary, and the salary was applied to children who could not come there because their parents couldn't afford the tuition. So her salary would be their tuition. She did that for over 25 years. So you get a sense of what kind of a woman, kind of a human being she was. Just remarkable. And in 1986, Muriel had a series of massive heart attacks in her 50s, so very young, late 50s. And the third heart attack left her heart so weakened that the doctor told both she and her husband that there was no real chance of any reversal or recovery, that she was slowly moving towards her death. And he gave her probably about 6 months. So I came up around Christmas time to visit and to see her. And I hadn't seen her in a while because I was living in Florida at the time, going to school. And I remember when I walked into the room, she did not look anything like herself. I would not have recognized her had her husband not said, "There's Muriel." And I went over to her, and her voice was very faint. She was extremely weak and very emaciated, and I realized it was the last time I would see her. So, 2 remarkable things happened to her after this, and I won't go into the second one in detail, but the second one is that she was healed completely by God in an extraordinary event, where her heart was restored back to its, not only its original condition of a 58-year-old woman, but back to, as the doctor said, a 30-year-old's heart. So a remarkable, extraordinary thing. But before that, something happened that she shared with me later, almost a year later, because she had been healed. She lived on for quite a number of more years. She said one night just before Christmas, she had a daughter and grandchildren, and she was very, very weak, as I said. And she said Christmas morning was coming and the grandchildren were going to come over the house, and she was very sad because she was so weak. And one of the reasons she said she was so weak at that time was she couldn't sleep. She was uncomfortable all the time, so she couldn't sleep for the night. She hadn't slept for the night in months, so she was exhausted all the time. She couldn't get up. She had no energy. So the night before Christmas, she was laying in bed, and she said she was overcome with such profound sadness. Not because she was sick and weak and dying, which she said she had already surrendered herself to, but because she couldn't spend Christmas morning with her grandchildren playing with them one last time. And she said she laid there in bed and she cried. And she said, I said to Our Lady, she had a deep devotion to Mary, she was praying the rosary at that moment, and she said to her, Mary, please, please let me sleep. And she said, as soon as I said the words, please let me sleep, she said, this beautiful woman appeared at the foot of my bed, and it didn't scare me. Her presence was incredibly comforting, and I felt this amazing warmth go through my body and this sense of serenity, and I fell asleep. And I slept for the whole night. And I woke up Christmas morning full of energy enough to get up and to be in the room with my grandchildren. And she says, you know what it was when I saw her, and she's not a woman who ever says things like this. She's the most pragmatic, ordinary, regular person you can imagine. So for her to say this, quite remarkable. She said, what Mary did when she appeared at the foot of my bed, she said she smiled. And as soon as she smiled, I fell asleep. Because I knew all is well. All is well. Because what Mary does is Mary magnifies the Lord. And when the Lord is near, no matter what the circumstances, all is well. All is well. So, to me, that's the gift that Mary brings. Mary comes into this valley of tears, this place of trial and pain and sorrow, and she brings the smile of heaven to earth. Mary was conceived without sin. And Father's homily was really beautiful. Mary was conceived without sin. Mary is, as the early fathers of the church, Father Billy mentioned, was called the New Eve. The New Eve, because she was the beginning of a new creation that God was beginning now. A new creation. Out of the rubble of this fallen world, God was creating something new. Something new. And the first Eve, in the first creation of this world, the first Eve was created without sin. Immaculate. And so when God chose the time to recreate this world, and chose the woman through whom he would accomplish it, as God himself became human in the midst of a fallen world, he also made her without sin to begin. So Mary is the beginning of the new creation, the new Genesis, where God begins everything anew by taking this broken world and recreating it. And at baptism, he comes to each one of us and does precisely the same thing. He comes into my broken world, and out of my broken world recreates something beautiful, something new. And of course, today's feast day of the Immaculate Conception, by the way, is of course your patroness's feast day, is it not? Because Anne had something to do with that Immaculate Conception, if you understand what I mean. Right? In the Eastern Orthodox Church, my father, who just died in April, was Russian Orthodox, my mom Roman Catholic, so I grew up in an Orthodox and Catholic home experience, churches back and forth week to week. And in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the icon or the image of Mary as the Immaculate Conception is an icon of Joachim and Anne embracing tightly and kissing. Isn't that beautiful? That's where the conception came from. From them. From the love between a man and a woman. Mary was the new Eve. Mary was the new Eve, conceived without sin because she was redeemed by her son's death. Isn't that crazy? Mary was redeemed at the moment of her conception by the death of her son, who had not yet been conceived. He redeemed her. Jesus, at his death, redeems all of history, from beginning to end. And Mary is the first fruit of his death. He redeems her from the very beginning of her existence. So she, more than any of us, can call him, as she does in the Magnificat, God, my Savior. Because he saved her to the very root of her being. Her existence is being saved, redeemed. She is the first of the redeemed. So each of you in this church tonight, I assume, is baptized. All of you have been baptized. Baptism is an extraordinary sacrament. And it's an undervalued sacrament in our church. Baptism is the first sacrament. It's the foundation of all the sacraments. It's the gateway to all the sacraments. In baptism, all of us are plunged, literally, into Christ and into his death and his resurrection. Everything that God came to bring us in Christ, in baptism, we are plunged into that. And baptism affects us and changes us in innumerable ways. But I'm only going to mention a few of them. I want to reflect on a few of those effects and connect them to Mary, because every one of these effects that we receive from baptism, Mary herself exemplified. So first in baptism, well, oftentimes when we think of baptism, the first thing we think of is forgiveness of sins, right? You're washed clean of sin, we're forgiven of original sin, or for adults, we're forgiven both of original sin and our actual sins we've committed, which is true. But really the most fundamental effect of baptism in our own Catholic tradition is that, to use a wonderful evangelical Protestant phrase, we are born again. We're reborn in baptism. When we enter down into the water and we come out, we are reborn as sons and daughters of God. Reborn. My wife is a music director at St. Philip Neri in Metairie, and has been a music director for almost 35 years. And our fourth child, our daughter Catherine, my wife was about to deliver right around Easter time. And my wife was singing at the Easter Vigil, right around the time of the baptisms during the Easter Vigil. And during that time of singing, her bag of waters broke. Is that extraordinary? And labor began the next day. Easter Monday, baby. How's that? I said you should have announced that, because the baptism would have made a lot more sense. Because we're born with lots of water and blood, which is exactly what happens in baptism. We are immersed into the dying and rising of Christ, who dies in the tomb and is reborn to new life for us. And then he allows us to share in that. My dad and mom divorced when I was quite young, and my dad remarried. And he remarried a woman who was Romanian Orthodox, and they were married for 38 years, and then he died this April. And my dad and my stepmom had 2 children, 2 sons, and one of the sons he's in his mid-30s now, he has Down syndrome. And he has autism and Down syndrome, and on the spectrum of disability, he's severely disabled. Beautiful, beautiful man now. The most affectionate member of our family. As a matter of fact, as my dad was dying, Mikey would climb up, when I was there, climb up into my dad's cot and wrap his body around my father so that you couldn't even see my father anymore. Because my father, who was a 250-pound man, was 91 pounds in that bed, and then Mikey swallowed him up with love. What a beautiful man Mikey is. But when Mikey was very little, when he was born, he had all kinds of physical problems. He had lots of ear infections, and he was in the hospital over and over again for almost the first 3 years of his life. And because of that, my stepmom and dad didn't have him baptized. They kept putting it off, waiting for the right time, and there was never a right time. And so finally the pastor of the parish they were in convinced my stepmom and dad and said, don't wait anymore, just have him baptized. We'll do it this Sunday after the liturgy, bring him over afterwards, and we'll have him baptized, just bring your family. And so we did that. So my dad invited my siblings from his first marriage to come. A couple of them came, I was there, and we had the baptism. And Mikey was 3 years old, and he's a pretty big guy, 3 years old. And the Orthodox Church baptism is done naked, because, well, that's how you're born. So you're naked, you're stripped naked. So in the church, huge font of water, and Mikey standing over here, my stepmom strips his clothes off, so he's standing there naked. Of course, Mikey doesn't know what's going on. Why am I naked in the church? This has never happened before. And why is this large man with a beard and colored clothes coming at me with his hands out to pick me up to baptize him? So Father Stefan, the Russian priest, picked Mikey up and brought him over towards the font, and Mikey was very afraid, you could tell. And so my stepmom came over to him and just kind of held him all the way over and tried to speak in sign language to him that everything's okay. This is God's bath. God's bath, that's all. So Mikey calmed down. He went over to the water and he plunged Mikey down 3 times into the water, all the way under. First time down, Mikey came up like this. Second time like this. And the third time went like that. It was so beautiful. But Mikey, because of all the ear infections he'd had, was deaf. He couldn't hear, so he couldn't speak. So he's deaf-mute. He could make screeching sounds, he could make grunge sounds, he could make different sounds depending on, so at this time he had a high screech because he was excited, but he couldn't speak words, had never spoken words, and he didn't speak words until he was in his early teens when they had done corrective surgeries and implants, and he was able to hear, and now he can communicate. Anyway, hadn't spoken. So down in the water 3 times, naked Mikey, taken out the 3rd time, given to B, my stepmom. And B is holding him, and my dad's standing right next to him, and she's holding naked Mikey, and she said it was all just like he was born again, literally. Instead of amniotic fluid, it was baptismal fluid. Beautiful. So she's holding Mikey, and Mikey reaches over, and he grabs my dad, who has a little ponytail, grabs my dad's hair, and pulls my dad's head down towards my stepmom's head, so their heads touch right next to him. Little family. And Mikey says with crystal clear words, "I love you." He shouted those words out. Never spoke before, never spoke again until he was in his early teens. And everyone, all of us broke down, crying, everyone, including Father Stefan, the priest. You can imagine the emotion of this miracle, of this boy, and of all things he could say in this fractured, broken family. to us, as he pulled those two heads together, summed up everything that baptism is. Because we are reborn from a God who is love. And so those who are born of him, as 1 John, the letter of 1 John says, those who are born of him love as he loved. How did he love? He showed what his love is like in Christ on the cross. So God is love. And Father Stefan, the priest, after Mikey shouted those words out, and we all kind of calmed down and stopped sobbing, especially my mom, my dad, and my stepmom were sobbing. It was beautiful to watch, very, very beautiful. And then the priest, Father Stefan, after everyone calmed down and he kind of pulled himself together, he said, I am supposed to preach now. What do I say? Mikey has said everything. Right? This is the point. He said, this is the point of all of it. The water, the altar, the church, these robes, the Bible, all of it exists for one reason, so that we can live and speak those three words with our life. And he says, if you do not want to live those words, then stay away from that water. And he pointed to the altar and he says, do not eat from that table. And he's saying this to a broken family. He knows exactly who he's speaking to. And my dad afterwards said to me, because we all recognize the power, he said, wasn't it like the water of that baptismal font washed over the edges, overflowed on our family, and healed the broken creation and brought a new creation out? It's exactly what it was, Dad. It's exactly what I experienced. Reborn. As sons and daughters of God. That's a privileged title. Sons and daughters who are given the privilege of calling God Abba, which is the Aramaic word that Jesus used to describe the Father, which is the term that's used by a child for a father. Daddy. Abba. If you haven't seen the movie Instant Family, I highly recommend you do. It's still in the theater. It is an extraordinary movie. It's about foster care and adoption. And I'm not going to do a spoiler, but I'll tell you that, to me, the most beautiful moment in the whole movie, this husband and wife, Mark Wahlberg is the husband, the actor, adopt these children. I won't tell you any of the details. But the most beautiful moment is when one of the foster children calls Mark Dad. There's one moment when they're having all the trouble of trying to get these children to adjust, and they're being very difficult and angry, and then all of a sudden, one moment, he says to him, just spontaneously, Dad. And Mark's face lights up. Dad. What does Dad represent? You realize in that movie what Dad represents, what Son represents. So he says Dad, and he looks at him and he says, Son. So what do you see? You feel the trust. You feel the love, you feel the affection, and the caring, and the self-sacrifice, and the protection, and the provision. This is the way it's supposed to be, at least. That's what Dad means. That's what Mom means. And so when God adopts us as his sons and daughters, we enter into this relationship and grow into this relationship with him of trust, and love, and affection, and caring, and self-sacrifice. It's a term of intimacy. My son Nicholas, who now is studying physics at Loyola, when he was 5 years old, he's always been our left-brained, logical child, extremely intelligent, but not our most affectionate, huggy, warm, fuzzy child. And I remember when he was 5 years old, I was putting him to bed one night, and when we put our children to bed, we had a tradition of doing a little blessing over them. We'd say a prayer, and then we bless them with the sign of the cross on their forehead. We've done that all their lives until they got to a certain age where they kicked us out. And now I do it outside their door like this, singing. And you can't tell any of my children I tell stories about them, otherwise I'll be banned from the house. Anyway, Nicholas, he knows I tell this story. Nicholas, 5 years old, so I'm putting him to bed, I'm blessing him, and as I'm blessing him, he takes my head, pulls the back of my head and pulls his face right up to mine, and gets his face really close to my face, And he says, "Daddy, my heart burns for you." My heart burns for you. 5 years old. And the first thing that came into my mind was not the all that you just did, which I think now, it was, when you're a teenager, you won't say that. I did. I thought, you'll say, "Daddy, I want to burn you." And so it happened. You think I'm kidding? But I thought that's an extraordinary thing for a little child to say. So I went to my wife and I said to her, I said, "You won't believe what Nicholas just said to me." And I recounted. I said, "Where in the world did he get that from?" And she goes, "Well, isn't it obvious?" I said, "Well, no, it's not obvious." "Where did he get it from?" She said, "Well, what's on the wall in our prayer room area? What's on the wall?" I said, "It's a picture of the Sacred Heart." And she said, "What's the heart doing in the Sacred Heart?" I said, "Oh, it's burning." And she said, "Do you remember last week when we were praying and Nicholas, our little logical physics major, said, 'Daddy, Jesus' heart is on fire. That doesn't look too good.'" That's what he said. And then I explained it to him. I said, "No, the fire is like his love. He's so in love with us. He's just burning with passion. He loves us so much that it's like a fire." And he internalized that, obviously, and thought about it. And then when he felt it, he said it. I thought, now that is what prayer is about, by the way. You so internalize divine love that it's the way that you see the world. It's the way that you speak to others. Awesome. But that intimacy between a father and a son, between a mother and a daughter, whatever it is, this is what God wishes to have with us. It's why he adopts us. He wants to love us like that and us to love him like that. That close. So you can smell his breath. It's awesome. That's the intimacy God wants from us. When my dad was dying in April, I went up there to spend the last days with him. And one of the days he had dementia. And one of the days, one of the people working in the dementia unit said to me, "You know, I have to go. Would you go ahead and feed your dad for me?" Feed my dad. I've never fed my father before. It was the single most intimate experience I'd ever had in my entire life. To feed my dad. And after I finished feeding him, he didn't speak much, and he didn't probably know who I was most of the time, but after I finished feeding him, he said, "Thank you, son." And that just summed up my whole life in relationship with him. You're welcome, Dad. Thank you, son. This is what baptism opens to us. Baptism also makes us, in the language of our Catholic tradition, into temples of the Holy Spirit. Temples. In Judaism, the temple in Jerusalem was built. It's where God dwells on earth, as he dwells nowhere else in all of creation. He's more intimately present to creation in the temple than he is anywhere else. And in the temple, there's a central place called the Holy of Holies, which is where his glory abides. And very few people dare to go in there, because the presence of God is so in your face that you have to be absolutely prepared to meet him. So in the New Testament, St. Paul says that because of baptism, our bodies are now temples. Our bodies. And not just temples, but he uses the word for the Holy of Holies. Your body is the Holy of Holies. And if you're a Jew, your knees shake when you hear that. It's you. The dignity of who you are. There's a priest in North Attleboro, Massachusetts, his name, French-Canadian priest, Father William Babette, who's long deceased now. He was the priest, by the way, who brought about the healing of Muriel Bassett through his prayer over her. And he had a healing ministry up there, and he was in his late 70s when I met him, when he prayed over Muriel. and he had arthritis so severe that he was in a wheelchair. He couldn't get out of it. So while he prayed over people to give them healing, he was crippled with pain in a wheelchair. Talk about the wounded healer. So one time I went to Mass on a Sunday with Muriel brought me to the church after she'd been healed. She brought me to meet him. And it was a Sunday Mass, and I'll never forget it. He celebrated the whole Mass in his wheelchair. And they had built a ramp so that the ramp made him able to be high enough in front of the altar so you could see him. Otherwise you couldn't see him well. And during the Mass that day, there was a baptism of an infant. And so he did the baptism from his wheelchair into the baptismal font and poured the water. And then after the baptism was over and finished pouring the water, he pulled the wheelchair back and he slowly, over about a minute or minute and a half, got out of the wheelchair, down onto his knee, in front of the mother and the baby. And he said, "Behold the temple of the Trinity." He said, "Now raise this girl aware that she is that temple." It was an awe-inspiring moment. Never forget it. I know that mother would never forget it, and the father would never forget it. The dignity of who we are. We are temples. And in Judaism, a temple, you might say, is God's base of operations. It's where he blesses the earth from. He blesses the earth. So there's a beautiful psalm that says, "May the Lord bless you from Zion." And Zion is the mountain the temple is on. So now it is this. It's not, "May the Lord bless you from Zion." It's, "May the Lord bless you from him and her and all of you." Wherever you go out in the world now, you are his base of operations. He now uses you to enter into the world and to bless it. Baptism has made you into a temple. Baptism also plunges you into the death and resurrection of Christ, into his dying and into his rising from the dead. In the Orthodox Church, the baptismal water is on purpose made cold with ice before the baptism, so you feel a bit of the death, except for babies. Then it's warm. Death. So you go down into the water of death, and then you come out to new life. And then you spend the rest of your life living that pattern out. Dying to yourself and living for God. Dying to self and living to others. Dying to sin and living to grace. Right? That's the whole pattern of life. So baptism inaugurates us into Christ's own dying and rising, his death and resurrection. So our life now becomes patterned after that. 9/11, September 11th, everyone knows what that means. I don't need to say any more. If you've ever been to the 9/11 memorial and you look at the list of all the victims of 9/11, 0001 is Father Michael Judge, the Franciscan chaplain of the fire department. Now, he was not the first victim. Others died first. As a matter of fact, he was in the second tower when he was killed. He was killed by the debris. When the first tower collapsed next to it, the debris came into the second tower's building, and the debris struck his head because he had his helmet off, listening to someone's confession, and the debris struck his head and cracked his skull, and he died. And if you type in Father Michael Judge online into Google Images, there'll be your first pictures that'll come up are the pictures of 5 firefighters carrying his dead body out of the site. It's the most both tragic and magnificent picture you can imagine. And they carried his body from the site to St. Peter's Church, which is the nearest church to the site. They kicked the doors open, they brought him in, and they laid his body in front of the altar and left it there. And there lay the symbol of everything that his baptism represented. He poured his life out for others to the end, shed his blood, and then offered it on the altar to the Father. That's the purpose of life. So he was listed as number 1 precisely because those who chose it wanted him to be the symbol of America's response to the terrorist attacks. That is the martyrdom that is worthy of Christ. That's what makes America great. Martyrdom. laying down your life for the other. Self-sacrifice. So baptism plunges us into that. My stepmom's name is Beatrice, and she is really a remarkable woman in many, many ways. And Bea has dedicated just about her entire life to raising Mikey, my half-brother Mikey, who has Down syndrome I told you about. And the relationship between them is absolutely beautiful to watch. And one of the things that Mikey suffers from is insomnia. Mikey has severe insomnia. He goes for long stretches of time without sleep. 2 to 3 times a month, usually twice a month, he goes for 3 nights and 4 days without sleep in a stretch. And Mikey's afraid of being alone, especially at nighttime. So Bea, when he started having this insomnia in his early teens, up until the present day, whenever Mikey goes through his stretch of no sleep, Bea stays up with him. She doesn't sleep 2 to 3 times a month for 3 nights, 4 days in a row, and she's done that for all these decades. And I remember about 7 years ago, I was talking to her on the phone, and somewhere in the conversation, she said, she was stumbling for words. She said, I'm in the middle of a stretch right now, so if I sound a little incoherent, that's why. So I used it as an opportunity to honor her. I said, I want to tell you, Bea, all these years I've watched you, what you've done for Mikey, the way that you love him, and the way you give up sleep, and the way that, especially, that you never complain. I've never heard you once complain about that. That's extraordinary. I don't know if I could live through that kind of not sleeping periods. But I said, so I just want to honor you for that. And I said, whenever I want to complain about anything going on in my life, I just think about you and the stretch. And I shut my mouth. I don't say anything. And she said, as she always does, dismisses it. She said, it's nothing. She said, Mikey's the champ. Mikey's the champ, not me. Mikey's the one who has insomnia, not me. I just stay up with him. Mikey's the one who doesn't understand what's going on and is afraid. I'm not. I'm just with him. So Mikey's the one who's great, not me. And then she said something incredibly profound, which is baptismal to the core. She said, I tell your dad, if I ever get to heaven, if I'm ever saved, it'll be because of Mikey. Because Mikey taught me how to love. She said, I never knew how self-centered my life was until he came into it. And she said, then he pulled me out of myself. And I thought, that's the best definition of salvation and of heaven I've ever heard. Salvation is being made capable of love, of dying to self, of pouring yourself out for someone else. That's what heaven is. This is why Mary is in heaven, spends all of her heaven doing good on earth. If I got to heaven, I'd check out. Done. Did my duty. She just begun. Because in heaven, your capacity to love is finally fully freed. All the chains of selfishness that held you in this life are gone. And now you can love absolutely, completely, and totally. And saints are those who already begin to live that heaven life now. Give us a taste of heaven now, which is to learn to live like that. Bea also has a practice in the Orthodox Church. The bread for the Eucharist is made by the parishioners each week. So a family is selected each week to bake the bread for the Eucharist, and there's a very strict recipe, and there's little tools you have to use to make certain symbols on it, and it's got to be a certain size and shape, so it's very strict. But they go from family to family. The idea being that the families are the ones producing the bread brought to the Mass. The connection between the families and the church is clear. And the connection between what the bread represents and the Mass is clear. So Bea, to make this point, said that same night we were having this conversation, she said, my favorite thing to do, I love when we get to bake the bread. I bake the bread. When it comes to our house, to do it the week we do it, if Mikey has a stretch during that week of insomnia, I wait till the second night, which is always the hardest night. In the middle of the second night, I bake the bread when I'm exhausted. And I put all my exhaustion in there. And I put Mikey in there. And I put your dad and my love for him in there. And I put Mikey's love for us in there. I put all that stuff in there. I put it into the bread when I bake it. And then when I bring it to the church, it's so awesome. When I see them bringing it up to the altar to consecrate it, it's the most awesome thing. Because I know where that bread came from. And I know where it's going. It came from our life. And it's going into the kingdom. Where it will never pass away. And the words that change the bread and the wine, or the bread, how perfect, because the words that change the bread into Christ are, "This is my body broken for you." That's what transforms this world into the next world, this creation into the new creation. Lives that say, "This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you." That's what changes this world into the next world, which makes material worthy of the next world. I said to her at the end of that conversation, so I guess you could say that the purpose of life is to bake bread, isn't it? That's the purpose of life, to bake bread and bring it here. Last couple points. I had the privilege in 1990 to 1991 to work as almost full-time, just about full-time volunteer, co-worker as they called us, at Mother Teresa's Home for the Dying in Washington, D.C. It's called Gift of Peace. And it was for homeless people who had HIV/AIDS, who were in the last stages of the illness, who were dying, and had nowhere to go to die. And since they were homeless, they had no family, no one to take care of them, so they would bring them into this home. She had established it in 1986. And so I worked there for almost just under 11 months, about 10 and a half months. And it was the single most transforming experience of my entire life, other than marriage and parenting. Utterly transforming. And I'm going to share with you one story from that time there to end as a symbol, a sign of exactly what baptism does, what faith in Christ does for us, those of us who are open to its power. But when Mother Teresa came, she gave a little talk at the place. She came to visit in the spring of the year I was there. She came by and gave a talk to the volunteers, which I actually missed because we had a health crisis with one of the patients during her talk, so I missed her talk. But during her talk, she said two profound things that later on we got the transcript. One of them was, if you have no hope, find someone else who has no hope. Give them hope, and you will find hope. The first thing she said. The second thing she said was, all of you here today, all of you volunteers are called to be saints. I'm called to be a saint. You're called to be a saint. So she said, what is a saint? She said, a saint is one in whose presence it's easy to believe in God. A saint is one in whose presence it's easy to believe in God. Because in that person, his attributes, his character is evident. They're like a clean window, transparent to his light. I thought, what a magnificent image of precisely what happened in this place I worked at with these nuns, these missionaries of charity, in the months I was there. The people that came into this place, Gift of Peace, from the streets of D.C., were the hardest people I'd ever met in my entire life. Hardened by life for obvious reasons on the streets. Tough, hardened, bitter, angry, cynical, hurting, depressed, whatever you can imagine. And one of the things I noticed in all those months, that the reactions of every person who came in there were different. But what was similar was this, and this is the image I used at the end of it in my journal when I was writing at the end about my experience. I said it was like everyone who came into that place was like a flower, a rosebud that's very tightly closed and that never dared to open for fear that if it ever opened up on the streets, it would be savaged by those around them. So it just stayed protected and closed. But once they came into this place, you watched them bloom. They opened. Because they were in an environment that was shaped by Christ himself, which allowed them to be fully human, to be safe, and to be human. So I watched them bloom. It was remarkable to watch the change in people. And I'm going to mention one person's story that I'll end with here as a sign of that ties hopefully these themes together. And this story is about a woman. I don't remember her name, unfortunately. I don't remember her name, but I call her Mary, after Mary Magdalene. And Mary was a 24-year-old woman who came to Gift of Peace, dying of HIV/AIDS, and she was a prostitute on the streets of D.C., 24 years old. She was a prostitute for 12 years, so do the math. She became a prostitute at 12 years old. She was made a prostitute because her mother sold her on the street in exchange for a lifetime supply of heroin, which the mother got because she lived about 6 more months before a heroin overdose killed her. So she was sold onto the streets and was never able to get off. And so the only time she was freed from the streets was when she was dying. So she came in. I remember the day she arrived in the ambulance. The people who would come to the hospice arrived in an ambulance with a police officer. That would always be the pattern. So she came in the ambulance, and we would all, every time a new resident would arrive, we would all go outside to greet them. We were outside, and they opened the back of the ambulance up, and the paramedics came out with her. And I remember this, the only person in the entire time I was there like this, as she came out, her mouth was spewing the most foul imaginable words at everyone standing there. She was indicating that she had no interest in coming to this place, to put her back on the streets. And there was one of the sisters who was up front, Sister Minorima, who's from India, who was standing there really sweet in her beautiful white and blue habit, as this woman, Mary, is saying to her every vulgar word you can ever imagine, the most crass one imaginable. She's saying them directly to Sister Minorima. The scene was quite striking, just to say the least. And they continued to bring her out and just kind of ignored it and brought her over. And as she walked off to the side with the police officer, she turned over and she went, spat, right on one of the sisters, And I turned to Peter, who was my co-worker volunteer. We worked together in a team. I looked over at him and I said, if it were up to me, I'd throw her out. Because you know how many people out there want to be here? And then he said, that's why you're not a missionary to charity. Precisely. Well, I don't belong here. And then over the next, just under 9 months, watching Mary, I suddenly understood why Mary was precisely the one that belonged there. Because on the streets, she knew nothing of a father. She knew nothing of love and trust and self-sacrifice for her. So she came in and they put her over on the women's side, so I worked on the men's side, so I could hear her every day down the hall. You could hear her, because you knew it was Mary, because she was cussing and swearing. You could hear her down the hall, loud and clear. And it went on for just about 2 weeks, every day, like a routine. And then one day, I remember a whole day passed and we didn't hear anything. We didn't hear any Mary. I thought, wow. And then another day passed and I remember thinking, wow, I wonder if she died or something happened. So the rest of the story I'll tell you in brief, I got from the eulogy at her funeral the next spring, late spring, from Father Mike, who was the chaplain there at the time. So he told us the story about Mary, about her background, about her mom, early upbringing, and she came in and he said, you all remember, all of you who are here, remember Mary, and you remember exactly what she was like, and now you know why. I'm sharing with you why she was like that. And he said, about 2 weeks, or just over 2 weeks into it, she became very quiet, and then one day she said to one of the sisters, can I talk to your preacher? So they brought Father Mike in. Father Mike went in the room, closed the door. He was expecting, Mary. And it was not Mary. because Mary was kind of quiet and meek. And she said, I just want to tell you something. All my life on the streets, she said, anyone who ever did anything nice for me always wanted something back from me. I've never been in a place where someone did something nice for me and they don't want anything back. And she said, if your Jesus is anything like these sisters, she said, I want to know him. Can you teach me who he is? Now, isn't that a remarkable sign of evangelization, as we call it, at work? Evangelization simply means the appearing of the gospel in the life of those who profess it. You can see it, smell it, taste it, touch it, feel it. So he said, I began the quickest RCIA I've ever done, because I didn't know how long she'd live. RCIA is the, class for converts. He said, so he took the Gospel of John, and he said, we're just going to take the Gospel of John, and I'm going to read it with you every day. I'm going to go through it, and when you finish it, you can decide if you want to become Christian or not, become Catholic or not, be baptized or not. So he said, every day I would go into a room, and we'd spend a period of time, and I'd read a section and explain it, and she'd ask questions. And he said, every day we do this, every day when I would come after maybe the first week, and when I get there, she would say things like, what took you so long? Let's do more, tell me more. He said, it's amazing, he said, because she had never heard any of these stories. She knew nothing, zero. It was a blank slate. It was extraordinary, he said. And at one point during the going through the gospel, she said to me, where does this guy come from? Nobody acts like this. Where does he come from? I never met any man like this. Ever. And he said, where does she come from? Where does he come from? Oh, let me tell you. He came down from heaven for you. And then he said, we finished our catechesis, we went through the rest of the gospel, and at the end of the gospel, she said, I'm ready. This is it. I want to do this. So, one Sunday came along, we didn't know any of this, by the way, so no one knew this is all private. And then one day, we saw her in the back of the chapel at daily mass. I saw her sitting back there. I remember walking in, seeing her and going, this is going to be an interesting mass. Mary in the mass. She was quiet, she just sat there, she didn't say a word. She was there every day for quite a stretch of days, up until the Sunday. And then the Sunday, she was there, she was dressed in this beautiful white dress, sitting up front. And then Father at the beginning of Mass explained that Mary has decided she wants to become Catholic, she wants to be baptized, and so today we're going to baptize her, confirm her, and give her First Communion in the community. And it was astounding. The woman who came in the day I saw her come out of the ambulance had what they might call a flat affect. There was nothing on her face. Her face looked dead. The woman at the altar that day for her baptism was smiling, was crying, was laughing, was alive. This is only 6 weeks later. It's extraordinary. Hearts unfold like flowers before thee, opening to the sun above. That was Mary. And so he baptized her. He went up, she was crying and sobbing and laughing during this whole thing, and he gets up there and he's going to pour the water, and he goes, yeah, I don't think I need to use this water, huh? Enough coming out of her eyes. But then he pours the water on her and he baptizes her. And then after he finishes baptizing her, then he confirms her with the oil chrism. And then comes time for communion. He has her come up first before anyone approaches and come up and receive. And he said during the eulogy, he said, when I gave her the Eucharist, I thought the host was going to leap out of my hands into her mouth. She was so hungry to receive it. And then he said, at one point when I was explaining the Eucharist to her, and then afterwards, after she had received that day, that Sunday where she was baptized, he said that evening, when I talked to her and asked her how it was, and she told me the feeling she had, and he said she gave the most profound explanation of Eucharistic communion I've ever heard in my life, but only she could have gotten away with it. She said, Father, that's the first time a man ever came into my body who loved me. She got it. She got it. So over the next days and weeks and months, as she progressed and got progressively weaker, she got progressively stronger. It was an amazing thing to watch. As her body got weaker, her spirit grew larger, more joyful. She wanted to do more to help out in the Gift of Peace house. She wanted to do what she could, which wasn't a lot, especially as time went on. She went to Mass every day, every evening after supper, from 7 o'clock till lights out at 10. She sat in the chapel every single night and sang. Just sang to the tabernacle. Just sang. Such joy. And that went on, and then she got weaker and weaker, and then finally, right near the time of her death, maybe 4 or 5 days beforehand, they brought her in on a cot with the back raised up, because she couldn't sit up anymore, and she even couldn't be in a wheelchair anymore, so they rolled the cot into the chapel. It was a beautiful sight, in the middle aisle of this cot, facing the altar. And I'll never forget it was the last time she was in the chapel. During the prayers of the faithful, when Father, we pray for the Pope, we pray and so forth, Lord, hear our prayer, Lord, hear our prayer. And then at the end he always said, and does anyone else have any intentions they'd like to speak? A couple of people said a few things. And then Mary said in this kind of beautiful, weak, but sing-songy voice, she said, "Oh, Jesus, please, take me now. I want to see you. I want to be with you, Lord. Take me. I want to go. Please take me." Then everyone said, "Lord, hear our prayer." And we proceeded with the rest of the Mass. And then 4 days later, Mary died. And then we had her funeral. And her funeral, there were so many people there who were touched by her. They were packed in the chapel, out in the halls, out into the front lobby, everywhere. There's probably 300 people there who had, over those months, been touched by Mary, affected by Mary. And the last part of the story that I want to share, so about 3 weeks or so, he said, before Mary died, she told Sister Minorima, the head of the house, she said, "Sister, I have one last request. I know I'm dying, and I have one last request, and I know you can't do it, and I know it's crazy, but I gotta ask it. I'm gonna regret it if I don't ask it. Can I become a nun?" Can I become a nun? Because I want to be like you all. I want to be like you. And so Sister's thinking in her mind, well, it takes 9 years before you profess final vows. So she says, well, let me see what I can do. And Father said she called Calcutta, which probably means either Mother herself or the other sister who was the leader at the time with Mother. And she said she called Calcutta and got permission to allow Mary to take private vows and to wear the white novice habit. So they put her in the white novice habit. They buried her in the white novice habit with the rosary around her waist. The woman who came in, a prostitute dying of HIV/AIDS, died a nun, a bride who was taken by her bridegroom, who loved her faithfully, who fed her with himself at his expense, not at her expense. She entered a whole new world, a world of joy. And I'd love to say this is my favorite thing that he said, Father Mike. He said, you know what's extraordinary? Mary came here dead, and she died alive. She died alive. May that be us every day.